All right, welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a really absolutely crucial topic to unpack today. We're looking at misunderstood labels and trying to figure out exactly when everyday, typical behavior actually crosses that invisible line and becomes a clinical disorder. Okay, let's dive into this. It's completely normal for a kid to be stubborn, just like it's totally normal for a teenager to be highly conscious of what they eat. We see it all the time, right? But when does that everyday stubbornness or that new diet cross the line and become a psychological disorder? That is the big foundational question we're exploring today. It's something that touches almost all of our lives, yet, honestly, it's so often fundamentally misunderstood. Our goal here is to separate those colloquial misunderstandings, like writing someone off as just a bad kid or saying a teenager is just on a diet, from the actual clinical realities of specific behavioral and eating disorders. We're going to bridge what we see in everyday life with the underlying psychology, and we're going to look at these behaviors through a lens of compassion and non-judgmental scientific understanding. So let's start with a group of conditions that typically manifest during childhood and adolescence. These are the disruptive, impulse control, and conduct disorders. Now, at their core, these are defined by a severe inability to control emotions and behaviors. We aren't just talking about a kid acting out or throwing a tantrum. This often leads to actions that actively violate the rights of other people or bring the individual into really significant and sometimes dangerous conflict with societal norms and authority figures. The very first condition in this category is oppositional defiant disorder, which you'll often hear called ODD. Kids with ODD display age-inappropriate amounts of stubbornness, they're persistently irritable, defiant, disobedient, and they generally behave in a hostile manner. Now, I know what you're thinking. All kids rebel. And that's true. But ODD goes far, far beyond normal childhood pushback. The reason this distinction matters so much is that it becomes an ingrained, persistent pattern of hostility. It drastically impairs a child's daily functioning and completely disrupts their relationships. It's not just a phase they're going through. It's a profound inability to regulate opposition. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this massive aha moment regarding ODD. Individuals with this disorder rarely see themselves as angry, oppositional, or defiant. No, instead, they completely justify their behavior as a perfectly reasonable reaction to the circumstances or the demands being placed on them. The symptoms actually become deeply entangled with problematic interactions with other people. The child truly honestly believes their extreme behavior is justified by what's being asked of them. They aren't trying to be difficult. In their mind, they're simply defending themselves against an entirely unreasonable world. Let's move to and see how this builds. Because while ODD is rooted in stubborn defiance, the clinical picture takes a much darker turn when we look at conduct disorder. This is a severe escalation into antisocial behavior. It's really crucial for us to distinguish the persistent pushback of ODD from the active, harmful violations we start to see as this condition intensifies. So conduct disorder and antisocial behavior refer to age-inappropriate actions and attitudes that actively violate family expectations, societal norms, and the personal or property rights of others. Think of it as a profound breakdown of the social contract by a young mind. The behaviors typical of conduct disorder are incredibly serious and, frankly, deeply concerning. We're talking about non-aggressive conduct that causes severe property damage, major deceitfulness or theft, serious and repeated rule violations, and even aggressive actions that cause or threaten real physical harm to people or animals. It is a fundamental disregard for the basic rights of everyone else around them. And this clinical aggression, it isn't just random. It typically manifests in 4 distinct ways. First up, there's verbal aggression. This involves intense, targeted name-calling and swearing. Second is physical aggression, so hitting and physical fighting. Third, we see hostile aggression, which is specifically and maliciously directed at inflicting injury to others. And finally, proactive aggression. This is where the individual dominates and bullies others completely without provocation. So again, these aren't just kids being kids on a playground. This is a structured outward manifestation of deep psychological distress and social misalignment. Okay, now we need to make a vital shift. We're moving from outward behavioral disorders that kind of attack the world around the person to inward struggles, specifically feeding and eating disorders, where the destruction is turned completely inward. These conditions are of special, really urgent interest to young people, and they can be just as deeply destructive as that outward aggression we just talked about, but the battleground is entirely within the individual themselves. The first of these inward struggles is anorexia nervosa. In anorexia, the individual has a profoundly distorted body image. This distortion leads them to see themselves as overweight, regardless of their actual objective physical state. What is absolutely crucial to understand here is the sheer power of this delusion. It's a profound distortion of reality that literally overrides biological survival instincts. This delusion leads to refusing to eat, exercising compulsively, and developing highly secretive, unusual habits, like refusing to eat in front of other people. The person may lose huge amounts of weight, and in severe cases, the delusion is so overpowering that they can literally starve themselves to death. Next, we have bulimia nervosa. This is a disorder characterized by a very specific, dangerous, and utterly exhausting cycle. The individual eats excessive amounts of food, and then they purge their body of that food by using medicines like laxatives or diuretics, or by self-induced vomiting. The psychological mechanism driving this whole thing is a tragic emotional coping cycle. See, the person often feels deeply disgusted, out of control, and deeply ashamed when they binge, but then they actually feel a clinical sense of relief from tension and negative emotions immediately after purging. The purge isn't just about calories, right? It becomes a deeply ingrained emotional release valve, trapping them in this vicious, continuous cycle. Finally, let's look at binge eating disorder. We need to contrast this clearly with bulimia, because in binge eating, there is an absolute absence of the purging behavior. Instead, the individual experiences frequent episodes of out-of-control eating. They tend to consume food at a much higher speed than normal, and they just keep eating until they feel uncomfortably and sometimes painfully full. A major defining factor of this condition, and really a key insight into that total loss of control, is that these massive amounts of food are often consumed even when the individual is not feeling physically hungry at all. The drive to eat becomes entirely disconnected from the body's actual nutritional needs. So the crucial point is, how does changing our vocabulary from just bad behavior or just a diet to clinical disorder actually change the way we support those who are struggling? Well, by recognizing the clinical reality of things like oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating, we strip away the stigma. We strip away the blame. We can replace our frustration with empathy and our judgment with scientific understanding. The next time you see a behavior that looks like extreme rebellion or an unhealthy obsession with food, I really want you to ask yourself a very important question. Am I looking at a choice or am I looking at a symptom? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the right questions.